Well, hi, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I have no slides, so it'll just be me talking. I have no idea what the title of my talk means. I didn't come up with it, so I have to apologize for any ambiguity that you saw. The actual proposal that I sent to the publica originally was to do something on data and capitalism. And, you know, I see that capitalism is represented in spirit in all the logos behind my back. But there's still something that I think we need to keep in mind. So I will focus and actually discuss quite a bit of politics, economics, and finance, which I think is important to keep in mind when we talk about questions like privacy. And in a sense, what I would like to do in my talk today is to actually try to be a little bit provocative. And if I had to give another title to this, it would probably be Beyond Privacy. And it might sound a bit weird for someone like me who have written a book about authoritarian states and the ways in which surveillance is happening online and in digital devices to be talking about Beyond Privacy. But I think it's very important to realize the particular way in which the debate about data, politics, subjectivity, and essentially surveillance is being framed. And I think that the privacy framework, as much as I love it, and as I think it is a very important set of issues, I think in some sense it's also very limiting. And it's limiting in terms of what it is that we can do about the future. And to kick it off, I think I'll start with an anecdote. Some of you may have heard about this guy, but Sean Buckles, a Dutch student who in March decided to do a very interesting experiment. He put up all of his personal data online on his website, and he decided to sell it to the highest bidder. Everything, his email, his passwords, his geolocational data, his health data, his notes, everything would be offered to the highest bidder who would get access to all of his data for 12 months. Right? And after months, he got about 53 bids, and he sold all of that for 350 euros. The act of this guy, Sean Buckles, the Dutch student, was clearly an activist act, right? It was not a matter of him getting rich. He didn't do it because he was an entrepreneur. He just wanted to show that our data has value, and some of that value is being exploited by companies, and we're not getting any of the returns, right? Except for the free services that they offer, which might actually not be as valuable as the data that we generate, which clearly reflects, is reflected in the total financial value of those companies. But I think the key to keep in mind here is that the technological and the economic and the social context in which such an act was possible is very important to keep in mind. I mean, in a sense, it has become very easy to collect, but also to commodify, right? To everything about you. All of the data that you constantly produce now is easily made extractable, right? It's easily packageable and it's easily monetizable, right? And of course, given the precarious economic situation we're in, and given that some of that data does have an economic value, quite a few of us are entertaining the idea that perhaps there is some value in this data that we might want to unlock, right? And for many people inside Silicon Valley, I think this also is a very appealing proposition. And it's an appealing proposition, especially to companies and startups that want to take on various data monopolists. Companies like Google, companies like Facebook, that have amassed a lot of our data and have built the entire business model essentially around exploiting it without compensating the users. So there is clearly a movement that is, I think, very populist in outlook that seeks to liberate our data from those companies. And a lot of that movement is driven by activists and hackers and technologists. A lot of it is driven by smaller startups whose basic value and basic value proposition in the economic model is quite different from those of Google and Facebook. Right? Instead of trying to sell advertising based on that data, they seek to provide the tools through which we ourselves can manage, monetize, and deal in that data directly. Right? So they seek to basically break up those monopolists and give us the means to do with this data everything we want. And I think there is clearly some appeal particularly in technological audiences, towards such a proposition. It would, of course, be nice to take all of that data and make it our own and then go and sell it. But I think we have to be very careful in making that assumption. I think we have to be very careful in moving toward a world where data is tradable, it's modifiable, and it is a commodity. Because ultimately, I think that world will also amplify many of the trends that do not have to do with politics or do not have to do with technology, but have to do with politics and economics that are already quite ugly. Right? And that brings me to what I said at the very beginning, how I think the way in which we talk about privacy right now is in some way limiting because it does not take note of this broader economic and social context. The argument I'd like to put forward is that we do see a major reconfiguration in how political, social, and especially economic institutions work, right? And they do want to provide services that are highly personalized, right? That are based not on a one-size-fits-all kind of approach, but on a highly personalized, specific service, right? They do want to know as much as they can about who we are to order us a better service, right? You already see that in companies like Airbnb, which basically claim that the fact that each of their users has a reputation, right, enables them to establish new markets and new transactions where markets and transactions couldn't have been built otherwise, right? You clearly see a way in which we are invited and encouraged to develop a reputation online and to proactively curate it, right? And some of that feeds into what I think is rather a naive framing of this issue, the framing of publicness. But some of it, I think, is quite genuine. And there is clearly a value proposition to a lot of individuals and entrepreneurs and ordinary people that can be unlocked from becoming more visible online. That's how we are being told that that's how we will be able to get better loans. That's how we'll be able to get better services. That's how we'll be able to get all of the other things which are currently unavailable to us because our actual reputation is not visible to the parties with whom we are transacting, right? And what I would like to argue is that the total apparatus, if you will, the totality of all of these incentives and the totality of all of these incitements to actively curate our reputation online does shape the way we think about ourselves and our future in a way that is not totally visible if you approach this issue solely from the perspective of sort of privacy and control of our own data. I mean, institutions, whether they're commercial or non-commercial ones, do shape the structural environment, if you will, in which we make these decisions. How to, become more visible, how to actually prove that we are credible renters, we are credible purchasers of insurance, we are credible drivers, we are credible this and that. I mean, there is clearly a set of incentives that does prompt us to become more and more publicly visible. Right? And if you start approaching these issues solely from the perspective of whether we are responsible for making the kind of data disclosures that we make, I think we miss a lot of space for activism and miss a lot of campaigns that could actually be tackling broader structural forces at play here. And here we would need to talk about capitalism, we would need to talk about neoliberalism, we would need to talk about whether it's risk society or the security state. We would need to start talking about broader issues that people who deal with issues like privacy, which are mostly hackers, technologists, and lawyers, do not necessarily want to talk about or tackle. Right? And my greatest fear is that, suppose that all of the good things that technologists and lawyers want to happen will actually happen, right? And we will develop perfect tools for encryption, we will develop perfect laws that will force big data technology companies to actually encrypt all of the data. We will force them not to share data with the security services as security services request the data. Imagine that all of that agenda actually happens, right? What I think we will find out is that in terms of how we still interact with the state, in terms of how we interact with commercial providers of services, whether it's hospitality, whether it's transportation, how we interact with banks that make decisions about whether to make loans to us, how we interact with, health system, how we interact with all of those institutions will be profoundly shaped by the agenda of making it personalizable and making it driven by reputation rather than by something else. And as long as it is driven by reputation, I think we will be forced to release the data, right? But since in the discourse in which we operate, this decision will be considered an autonomous one, right? It will be made because we actually think that it's good for us to disclose our reputation, to profit from certain discounts, or profit from certain programs, or to become, to rent out our apartment on Airbnb. That would lead to the erosion of the kind of space for shaping ourselves in the way in which we want to shape ourselves. Right? And that, I think, is the core area and the core goal of activism that we should be pursuing. Right? The goal of our activism should not be to give us the secure tools for sharing access to the information that we want. Right? Because I don't believe that the kind of information we disclose is fully dependent on whether we want to disclose it. It also depends on a lot of structural factors that are not under our control. If you want to go, again, to take the favorite example of the sharing economy, if you want to go to Airbnb, now, they would ask you for a proof of your identity, which might be a Facebook account or Twitter or a Google Plus account or something else, the LinkedIn, right? And if you don't do that, then you need to upload a video. But my basic point is that the shift that you are seeing in the provision of services, both commercially and non-commercially, does create a new set of pressures on us to develop our personality in a way that is, conducive to being seen as good and credible, right? As reliable and as trustworthy as we can, which I think is an issue of concern. Because, if you think about it, to quote one of the former senior executives at Google who went to start his own lending startup based on big data. So he is essentially trying to apply algorithms and big data to figure out whether banks should give you a loan. All data is credit data. That's essentially what he said. And if all data is credit data, meaning that everything that you do in your life partially determines whether or not you will receive a loan, or what insurance rate you will be charged, or whether you will be allowed in certain areas or not allowed in certain areas if we move to the sort of era of the smart city, that will profoundly shape how people behave. Right? And the kind of disciplining, if you will, that will happen through such schemas will probably pose a much greater threat to the development of our subjectivity and to the development of our personality than anything else, right? And this is where I think we have to broaden up this debate and to go beyond just purely technical and legalistic matters, which have defined this debate so far, where we look at the policies of tech companies, where we look at specific laws, where we look at encryption. All of that is fine, and all of that work must be done. The fear is that we might succeed in that project, and if we succeed in that project and don't do anything else about the structural factors that are reshaping how we reveal ourselves to institutions, businesses, and so forth, the point of those tools will not be particularly great, right? Because what's the point of giving me the tools to protect this space for shaping my own personality if the banks, insurance companies, and everyone else forces me to disclose as much about myself as I can? So you can argue that I make all of those decisions autonomously, right? And that I have full control about what I want to disclose to my bank. But the reality is that the banks make those decisions, right? And this is why I think we need to be able to recast the struggle in a much broader and much more political terms. I do think that we need to start thinking about data and privacy from perspectives that are grounded in finance, that are grounded in, when I mention finance, we have to be able to understand what are the financial values attached to this data and how some of these companies, will be using it in the future. If you think about a company like Google or Facebook, think specifically about Google. Right? Google right now is mediating more or less, or will be mediating in 2 or 3 years, many of the aspects of everyday life. They will have the smart thermostat, which they have just bought, and the smoking detector, which means that they are present in your bedroom. Through this smart car, they are present in your car, right? They know where you go. They know what accidents you get into. Through the smart detector, they know the risk that your house might get on fire. right? Through smart glasses, they get all sorts of other data, and not to mention the smartphone that you have in your pocket. If you think about it from the perspective of what this data can be used for, I mean, Google sits on tons of data that banks and insurance companies would kill for. Because Google knows how to price risk. They know what kind of risks you undergo in your everyday life, and they're in a much better position to predict whether you will default on your loan or not. Simply because, and as they move into the payment business, they will be able to make even better predictions about that. Right? And if that's the case, and I don't actually think that this is an unfeasible proposition. I do think that advertising is not the last frontier for what Google might do, given how much data they have accumulated, right? But if that's the case, we will start seeing the integration of this data into the provision of financial and other services. And if the idea is that by what we do in everyday life, we affect all sorts of other dimensions to our existence, whether they have to do with health, whether they have to do with insurance, whether they have to do with credit ranking and so forth, I do think that we will be moving into an environment where you will not have the kind of freedom to experiment, to put it in very banal terms, that we had before. And that has nothing to do with how much control you have about your own information. It has everything to do with how much power we allow the banks to have, right? So, it might sound like very bad news to some of you, but I think if we really care about how much space we want to give to people to experiment on their own lives and to undertake the projects of their own willing, the fight is not limited to building tools and passing laws that have to do with data protection. The fight also needs to expand and start tackling these broader regimes of, governance, governmentality, or whatever fancy term you want to attach to what we are seeing, right? And I don't think that the community from which, some of us come, which does tend to view these issues from very kind of narrow, well-defined perspective, which, in some cases works really well. It's really well, I don't want to disparage people building encryption tools or, pushing for data protection laws. I mean, if we don't have that, things will be even worse. But I think that, we have to be able to understand that those tools will not suffice, and those laws will not suffice, and that essentially the people working on net issues and people working on digital issues, especially in the activist community, we'll need to find a way to start linking to other social movements. And whether those social movements are the ones opposing the austerity agenda, or the ones opposing banks, or the ones opposing Wall Street, I mean, I think those alliances ought to happen. Because if those alliances don't happen, we will end up in an environment where, essentially, data will define, much of the subsequent decisions that we take in life. I mean, there is a startup now in the US that's doing really well that, for example, tries to predict whether you should receive credit, whether you should receive a loan based solely on your grades in high school, right? Which means that even your high school career now becomes a factor, right, in deciding whether, you will be given a loan or not. Right? And the rhetoric of this, of course, is all very emancipatory and empowering. And the idea is that for people who don't have credit data, who don't have a credit ranking, who do not have a credit history, the examination of all of those small details of everyday life, right, will allow to actually give them credit and to essentially will allow them to become bankable, if you will, just like everyone else is. But of course, this bankability comes at a price, and it's that all those domains of everyday life that were previously unrestrained or unpolluted, if you will, by the logic of money and credit, suddenly become polluted by it, right? And I think the answer here is not to, try to build tools or or fight for data protection laws. I think the answer here is to start questioning the nature of credit relationships and the way in which credit has become essential to success in our own life, right? So, and here then, if that's the framing through which you want to approach it, I mean, the kind of questions you will be asking will be very different from the normal digital questions that we ask. And I think it's very normal. And I think that that's the kind of question that this community should be asking. The questions to be asked do have to do with the nature of credit, the nature in which banks have taken a disproportionate role in determining policy. I mean, all of those questions ought to be asked at the same time as we're asking questions about Google and Facebook. Because this digital economy does not exist in its own realm. I mean, the very adjective digital makes it sound as if this stuff is disconnected from everything else that we do. It's disconnected from banking, it's disconnected from insurance, it exists somewhere in cyberspace, in the digital world, and I think all of that is nonsense. It's all profoundly grounded in what we do in our everyday life. It's all profoundly grounded in the kind of decisions we make, and it's all eventually driven by money. Right? So I do think that we need to figure out how we can reconnect or bring back, or maybe establish for the first time, the connection between some of the critiques that we see of the digital world, if you want to stick with that label, and some of the critiques of neoliberalism that we see. Because essentially, those are the times we are living in. They are the neoliberal times. And you can forget about it by focusing on some obscure digital aspect of the contemporary present. But let me assure you that that present is not particularly determining of your life situation. What is determining of your life situation does have to do with money, does have to do with credit, does have to do with banks. And it does have to do with the kind of governance mechanism you see, whether it's in state institutions and bureaucracies that do have to do with, switch to a new logic that has everything to do with preemption. Right? That's how we solve problems today. We don't even want to have a robust healthcare system. Why? Because a healthcare system would become unnecessary at a time when people can monitor themselves in real time and identify symptoms before they sort of turn into serious problems. Right? That's the sort of future of healthcare that is being sold to us by Silicon Valley. And in that future, there is perpetual monitoring of everything that happens to you precisely to avoid the visit to the doctor. Right? And it might be that, we're not particularly excited about seeing the doctor, and, for some of us, that will be a very, actually useful development. But I think you have to keep in mind that this logic of preemption, once it invades every aspect of your life, and it is possible now that, smart devices more or less intermediate already every aspect of your life, once that happens, I think the kind of decisions that you make will no longer be decisions that you could have made if you didn't feel the pressure of preemption. Right? But to understand that, we have to go and start looking into political agendas, whether those are agendas of big society or nudging or something else. This is real stuff. It is driven by ideology, and it is driven by political programs that most of us working in the digital space prefer not to look into, because there is just so much stuff in the digital space that's happening and so exciting and we want to talk about. And I think essentially that, it's in some sense very convenient to frame this as a question of privacy because we know what to do, right? It's just not being done. We know that we need encryption tools and we know that we need to pass laws. We have no clue what to do about Wall Street, what to do about banks, what to do about insurance companies, what to do about all of that. Right? We don't have a good answer. We can't build an app. We can't build a more secure protocol. And we don't even know what laws to pass, because all of those industries are deeply embedded into the state itself. Right? And that's the environment I think we're in, and we have to confront it. I mean, the environment we're in is not the one where, we can just put more money into tools and laws and just forget about the broader socioeconomic context. I think I'll probably running out of time, and we probably do have some time for questions. And I would actually like to hear back from you as well. So maybe we'll just open it up. There is a mic somewhere. You ever have 5 minutes? Okay, so if you have a question, I'll be happy to address it. Thank you.
So what is... So what does this kind of movement look like, where we take the concerns of the privacy issues and wed them to something that's questioning the role of banks in our lives or questioning the role of credit in our lives? How do you imagine that looking? What kind of protests do we have?
Sure. I think you already have a lot of movements in specific countries that are trying to push against some of this, to use this word neoliberal agenda, for the lack of a better one. I mean, you have a very strong anti-eviction, anti-austerity movement in Spain, for example, which probably is beginning to think about the way in which your data will eventually shape many of the decisions that have to do with getting mortgages and getting everything else. I mean, it's not, so for me, I think the key point that we need to keep in mind is that it's not possible and it's not needed, and I don't think it's desirable to have a social movement that will be focused solely on digital issues. And that's why I think, the pirates in Germany, they're an important, whatever tense you want to use. I mean, they had a very narrow mission, and that narrow mission might be good for a limited amount of time, but I don't think that, this movement will advance very far in terms of what it achieves if it focuses solely on trying to sort out the digital world as if that digital world was disconnected from everything else. Because essentially what I'm saying here is that, once everything is mediated by technology, the question of technology and the digitality kind of disappears. Right? Because then you really start asking questions about what that stuff is used for. And I think that infrastructure is here. I mean, God, we have like sensors in our trash cans. I mean, like it's here, right? And like once it's here, right, the question then becomes, sure, you can talk about privacy and everything else, but once there are incentives, political, economic, and social ones built into the system, we need to start attacking the ideology behind those incentives, right? We cannot just continue talking about privacy and encryption, which are important issues, right? But there are other ones. And I think that, we risk missing those other broader social, economical, political agendas that are governing how we live our lives by imagining that we are all autonomous individuals who can make these life-altering existential decisions about what to do with our data as if we did not have to take a mortgage or interact with our insurance company or go and talk to the state bureaucracy or something else. We do have to do that every day, right? And those are the logics that govern our lives. So yes, you can give me all the tools to secure my privacy, but if my bank wants to have all my data, right, and they don't actually put it that way, what good is that right? Right? And that's where I think we don't have a good answer, and we need to start asking it. And I don't want people to continue framing this issue as if all we had to do is to focus on these bureaucratic measures that will give you the right to privacy, while that right is not actually exercisable in practice.
We have one more question here.
Yes, if you're talking about loans, banks are giving to private customers. I mean, actually, today in Germany, you have a practice that you have to sign off an agreement that your private data will be given to an organization called Schufa, which is gathering all the private data of all private consumers in Germany. And based on that data, Schufa as an organization is providing a scoring service. And based on that scoring, the bank makes a decision whether a loan is given to the customer or not. And I understand that now new companies as Facebook and Google will have the big data also to provide other scoring services to banks so that they could rely on that scoring. And the political discussion for the Schufa scoring service was that Schufa should be obliged to disclose the algorithm Schufa is using to calculate the score. And of course, banks do not want that, and of course, Schufa does not want that, and it's a discussion also on the European level. And my question would be, do you think it is realistic that you could enforce Google and Facebook and co. to disclose their algorithm they will use to provide scoring?
So just to very briefly, it's not just the Google and Facebook are amassing all this data. It's just that and that's where I started. I said that you will be able to curate that data. I mean, it doesn't have to be in Facebook. It doesn't have to be in Google. The idea is that you would want to curate your online reputation because that reputation will then determine how you interact with all of those other parts of the sharing economy, be those transportation services or housing services or health services or something else, right? So it can be you, actively being asked to shape your profile, right? And that, the kind of logic that forces you to shape it is itself ought to be questioned. With regards to the transparency of the algorithm, I mean, yes, we can make the algorithm transparent, but it's not the algorithm that worries me. Like, what we need to question is the excessive role that credit has come to play in our lives. Right? And that you cannot do just by asking that the algorithm suddenly become more transparent. I mean, yes, we can say that now people will be governed by credit in a transparent manner, right? But it doesn't deny the fact that you are still making a lot of decisions in your life with what that algorithm will do in practice in mind. I mean, the fact that you know how exactly a decision you make now will be used to shape your loan profile. I mean, yes, it's important for you to have that transparency, but you also have to question whether your life has to be governed by that process in the first place. Right? And what I'm saying is that, yes, in the digital movement, we can focus on all of those issues and push for transparency of algorithms. We can, demand that there are strong institutional measures in place that will show us that no discrimination is happening, that none of our data is being shared with parties with whom we haven't agreed. All of that is fine. But it doesn't question the underlying agenda. And the underlying agenda, in my view, is that, the logic of credit scores is spreading to all of the other domains. Right? And as it's spreading to all of the other domains, be it health, be it transportation, be it housing, be it something else, right? It does make life into something qualitatively different from what it was. Before you had to think about how every decision that you make will affect your score on Facebook, Airbnb, Uber, and somewhere else. Right? And that, for me, is the way in which we have to start questioning it. The fact that we make some of this more transparent, I mean, it's important, but it doesn't question the underlying logic through which those systems operate. Right? And I think that's the logic itself, which is embedded in certain political and economic ideologies, that itself ought to be revealed, questioned, and perhaps, replaced with an alternative one, which I don't have, but which social movements should start working on, instead of just focusing on the narrow bits and pieces that they know how to solve, whether it's transparency or code or law. Thank you.
Yeah, vielen Dank. Thank you very much.